This kind of brings us to where we are today and why we're here. And we really want to clear up what did and what didn't happen over the past several weeks. Let me just kind of start with telling you the story. And this is the story. So several weeks ago, we heard from some parents that they were displeased with the leadership of the school, including Dr. Cortez and the board of directors. They asked for a meeting with the board to share their concerns, which the board of directors did facilitate. Unfortunately, the fact that the meeting was even held at all caused much confusion, concern, and speculation. Some thought, and it was told to me actually, that is this a witch hunt? Or a meeting just for people with a bone to pick with Dr. Cortez? The board wants you to know that this group of parents brought legitimate concerns about SCA, Southern Christian Academy, to the board. They probably would have done this through a regular board meeting process, but we have been remiss on timely posting of meetings, and the process is necessary to address the board. We kind of failed in communicating how do you air complaints, and then we had not made ourselves successful. So we had this meeting. During this meeting, there was no character bashing of Derek or anyone else. We all started the meeting out praying together for the school, the staff, the parents, and Dr. Cortez. We listened to the concerns of these families and left to process the information after the meeting. At this time, Wes is going to come up and talk about Derek's resignation and how that took place and just the specifics pertaining to that.
Great. Okay, so after the meeting, almost immediately after we left, what wasn't happening is none of us were saying, okay, well, obviously we need to go terminate Derek. Nobody was saying that. What's interesting, though, is that, in the public world, most of you know that the word resignation is a lot of times just a ruse for termination, right? I mean, that's what it is. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question. Hearing about concerns, what were the specific concerns? That's the part that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, well, I think Tanya is going to go into detail on those for the board, right? So we'll go into those on the board with, and I'll go in a little bit on Derek's side of things. You guys can hear me back there, though? Okay. So what happens anytime you have that is you have a meeting, and then a week later you have a resignation. Obviously, what naturally is going to happen is people are going to have assumptions and questions and start reading in things. And so what I'm going to do my best to do is give you, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. Okay, the thing that actually happened behind the scenes and what we saw. And I actually visited even with Derek today about this to recount it to him to make sure, now did I get this right or did I see something that is not true here? He said, no, you got it absolutely right. So what happened was, as soon as we left, we also started getting phone calls from other teachers and parents and people that were advocates very much for Derek. And all of them said, hey, look, we know that we don't know exactly what was said in this meeting, but we know that we love Derek and we want our own time to address the board about all the things that we like about him and all the things that he's done well and served well. And so naturally, we want to facilitate that as well because that's a responsible thing to do. The Word of God, I wrote Proverbs 18:17 says, the first one to plead his case seems right until his neighbor comes and cross-examines. And so all of us want to pay attention to everybody's perspective in anything that we're doing. But when we started to facilitate that and began to putting the date and time of that together, Derek is the one who came and said, no, I don't want to do that. He said, I don't want a meeting like that. And then he said, I want to alone address the board. And that's where last week when Derek resigned, that's exactly what took place. He came in, and I'm going to give you his reason behind why and what was going through his head, and we'll go from there. He basically came in and said, well, I'm going to resign. And I want you to understand my reasoning behind why. He said, basically, on one hand, we've got this group of parents that all love their kids, they love Summit, and they have a different understanding of the way that the school ought to operate than I do. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you get enough people in a room together, we're all going to have different opinions on how to do something. said, on the other hand, you've got all these parents and teachers who love and support what we've done, and specifically my leadership, and they want to voice that opinion. He said, and I'm sitting here, and then I look at the general body, which is the majority, who really don't know the details of either side of this, right? They just know they love Summit, they love the school, they love the kind of care that the teachers provide to their kids, and the kind of Christian education they get. He said, and here's what I see happening is we could go back and forth and argue about who's right and who's wrong here. And he said, but the reality is, if we do that, all that's going to do is start getting all these people down here to begin to go to one side or another. And that's just going to cause a great divide and a great division of the school, the way that I see it, and the way that I pray through this and feel like God is leading, is that this is a season where I need to go. He said, there's one guy who can bring clarity to this, and that's me. And he said, and what I want to do is just step aside for this season. He said, this is a prompting that's come before. He said, but this kind of rises up to the surface again, and I think this is the right thing to do, and I think God is in me resigning. So at that point is when obviously as a board we want to listen and we want to understand, but there's really nothing else to say at that point except for, well, okay. And so there wasn't, any scandalous behavior or all the things that we draw anytime we see a meeting and then a resignation. The families that were addressing us weren't just sitting there and character bashing and we said, okay, we got to take this and get rid of it. None of that happened. What happened was anytime you get a family of people together, what you're going to have is lots of different opinions. And you're going to have lots of and we can sort out whether they're right or wrong, but the reality is Derek felt like this was for the best of the school, and so that's the decision that he made. He felt like God was in it. And so that's kind of the rest of the story behind the resignation itself, so that all of you can know that. At this time, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rick, and then we're going to get into some of the other individual issues.
Just one more point on Derek's resignation is when he talked to the board, he said that for the last year, God had been laying on his heart that possibly it was getting to be the time for him to leave. So he had been contemplating possibly leaving for about a year. He said that after the financial crisis, he had given so much of himself that he felt like he had actually become a little bit burnt out. And he said, I found myself retreating to my office. I wasn't on the front steps of the school with a smile on my face anymore, and now looking back on it, he said that he really think he kind of reached burnout mode and had been contemplating it. And I think for those of us that knew him and know him, we did see him kind of hanging out in his office, retreating and kind of going in and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to make clear that he did say that it had been something he'd been thinking about for about a year. I want to talk now just where we are right now. And Tanya is going to come in a few minutes and talk about the board and bylaws and such like that. But first I want you to know the school is in very capable hands. George Hensley and Jana Andrews, our principals, with the oversight from the board, will do a fine job of leading the school in the interim. We are forming a committee to search for a superintendent. We're going to call this the transition committee. And we have a board meeting scheduled for this coming Monday night where that'll be one of the issues we take up. We've already reached out to ACSI and they have supplied a list. I just got it today on my email with potential interim as well as permanent superintendent candidates. That's just one of the sources that we're going to be looking at to try to find a replacement for Derek. The board of directors is going to be working diligently to find the right person to lead the school, and we do ask that all of you will pray that God leads the right person to us as well. I want to talk a little bit next just about communication, conflict resolution. And it's very clear to the board that we were not providing a conduit for proper conflict resolution. And that's what kind of built a lot of the folks up to where they felt like they had to call a meeting. And so that we just don't find ourselves in this situation again, I'd like to just kind of outline a clear system for folks to use if they do have concerns. Moving forward, we want to emphasize the need for all of us to follow the Matthew 18 principle for handling conflict. And many of the folks and the families that came to us had handled the Matthew 18 conflict in their minds, but they didn't know how to access the board. They didn't know who the board was, and so they weren't able to take the Matthew 18 principle all the way up to the board level. And that's really what kind of brought things to a head in their minds. But what the Matthew 18 principle calls for is that if you have a grievance or a conflict with someone, that you should go to that person first and try to solve the problem. And make every effort to deal with the situation one-on-one with that person. But then if you can't resolve the problem by using that first step, then you should go to that person's supervisor or the next person up the line and try to solve it through that process. And then, once again, if you make every effort and you go to that person's supervisor and they don't give you the answer you want to solve your problem, you should go on up the line. In the case of the school, that would be, if it's a problem with a teacher, you go to the teacher first, and then you would go to the principal of that teacher, and then you would go to the superintendent of that principal, and then the final, I guess, controlling authority would be the board of directors. So, you know, if that would have been practiced and the board would have been accessible, then I think we would have heard some of these concerns as they arose, not as they all built up and become unresolved and such like that. So we can all keep that in mind moving forward. The board's very aware that that was not a healthy process and that process was not in place. But we're very committed to make sure that is the process moving forward. Besides folks being upset with Derek, they're very upset with the board of directors, and rightly so. And our inability to comply with the bylaws, which is the governing document by which we should operate. And just to give a little history on that, you know, I said a little earlier, we were in crisis mode. That's not an excuse, but really looking back on where we were, you know, 07, 08, 09, I have to say the bylaws weren't really a priority. They should have been, but they weren't. Every year we have a board retreat, and we got a board retreat this September at the beginning of the year, and the board members, when they came, were all excited. You know, we had good prayer time, and I pulled the agenda out, and most of the agenda was about the bylaws. And so when I became board president in August, one of my main goals, now that the school was out of crisis mode, was to pull the bylaws out and try to begin the process of getting back to the practice of operating within the bylaws. Unfortunately, we didn't make that change fast enough. But we did form committees, we did walk through them, we did begin the process, and we assigned a committee to do the bylaw review and help educate the board in that process. What I'd like to do now is ask Tanya to come up, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the main things we have not been doing in accordance with the bylaws, and then talk a little bit about what we've already done and what we will be doing to start stepping toe-to-toe with bylaws.